Okay. Hello, everyone. Greetings from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar, Remembering Vietnam, The Road Through War. My name is Katie Munn, and I will be moderating tonight's program. And I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleagues across the country for tonight's event, including Amanda Melanson at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library and Museum in Austin, Texas. Hi, Amanda. We're also joined by Dr. Gregory Cumming at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California, as well as Barbara McGregor at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, joining us from the museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. The National Archives preserves and protects the historically valuable records of the United States government, and during this webinar, we will be using these records to look at the U.S. involvement in Vietnam through the lens of government policy. We will explore documents from the Johnson, Nixon, and Ford administration, as well as the United States Congress. We'll also explore ideas for how to bring these documents into your classroom. Tonight's presentation, part 2 of our two-part series, is not intended to be a comprehensive look at the Vietnam War. Rather, our goal is to connect you with primary sources that you can use to help further your students' understanding of the United States involvement and the decisions made by each administration regarding Vietnam. These documents are just a piece of the story and will also include information on how to find additional primary sources from the National Archives within our holdings to teach this topic. All these documents that you'll see tonight are available online, and you will receive the links to them via email. Looking at our poll, I see that we have some great responses for how you currently teach the Vietnam War, including primary sources like news clips, CIA unclassified documents, additional documents, images, speeches, photographs, and so tonight we're hoping to add to your toolbox. Well, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker tonight, Amanda Melanson.
Thank you guys so much for joining today. So like Katie said, this is not comprehensive. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about President Johnson and some of the pivotal moments in his policy making during the Vietnam War. So Lyndon Johnson became the 36th President of the United States after President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. As President, Johnson's priorities were really his Great Society legislation, but in August 1964, it became clear that America's involvement in Vietnam was deepening, especially after attacks on the American destroyers at the Gulf of Tonkin, which will be spoken about later. So by the end of 1964, Johnson's advisors warned him that the South Vietnamese government would fall unless the United States escalated its involvement in Vietnam. He wasn't really sure of this, and we have a lot of telephone conversations where you can hear Johnson talk behind the scenes with some of his advisors about his doubts about Vietnam. That's not what obviously the world saw on TV, but that's what he expressed behind the scenes. So the first step toward escalation came in early 1965 when communist forces launched an offensive aimed at cutting South Vietnam in two. Although the American and Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces stalled the offensive, this event helped to convince Johnson that there needed to be increasing United States involvement in combat in South Vietnam. The first document that we're going to look at today is from January 27th, 1965. It's known as the Fork in the Road document. 1 week after the inauguration, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy asked for a meeting with President Johnson. They present their views on the need to change the policy in Vietnam. So you can take a look at this document here on the screen. In it, Bundy really sums up where the United States is in the war, what's going on in the war, and why they need to make this decision sooner rather than later. So you can look and see the second bullet point on there. Let's see. Number 2 here. Let's see if I can use this. There we go. This is my first webinar, guys, so bear with me here. Number 2, if you want to read through that, it talks about where the troops are let's see, thank you, Katie, for helping, that the United States is currently waiting for a stable government, and that things are not changing, things are not getting better, and the policy needs to change. He goes on in sections 3, 4, and 5 to talk about the morale of the troops, or the perception of the United States, either from Americans, other people in the United States, or from overseas. And so we can scroll down to number 6 here and see this is where the fork in the road happens, where Bundy says, we think that there are two choices. One is to increase our military power, and the second is to just dedicate all of our forces to negotiations, not really forces, but all of our momentum towards the negotiation. Obviously, since we know what happened in history, we know that President Johnson is going to end up taking the first route, the military power route. What is interesting, if you continue to look down that document, he specifically points out, like in number 8 there, that not everybody agrees on these two policy options. Specifically, Dean Rusk doesn't agree, but what's interesting is that he says that Dean Rusk doesn't think that either will work out well, which is an interesting concept for students to look at and think about, to know that it wasn't like everybody was ready to dedicate these troops. President Johnson didn't really want to do it, and there were other people in the administration who didn't think that they'd be successful by designating more troops. So students you could use this document in your classroom to have students make their own decision or prediction if they don't know what happens next. Should President Johnson escalate the war in Vietnam? Obviously, you could do this with multiple documents, but this document gives you that decision of what are the pros and cons of each choice that he's being presented with. A lot happens between January of 1965 and July of 1965, including Operation Rolling Thunder, which I would guess that some of you probably teach about in your classrooms. And the president is considering this decision more heavily. And in July of 1965, he holds a press conference, and he announces two different decisions. One is to send in major forces, with more going in later as needed. And then second, to meet the manpower needs by increasing draft calls, not activating reserve units. So we're going to watch a video. It's a clip from the press conference that LBJ held on July 28th. And what's great about this, I'll give you a little side note, is the video can be found, the clip can be found after this, but we also have a YouTube page where all of our press conferences are uploaded, but also you can find the text of it on the American Presidency Project. So you can use either the text or the video in your class. So we're going to go ahead and play that, and then we'll talk about it after. What I like about using these two pieces together is that the document, the fork in the road document, is a secret document that's been declassified that only the president and his advisors saw, while the press conference is something that all of America could have seen or read about in the newspaper. So what are the differences in what's spoken about in this private document versus what is said to the American people? We do an activity here where kids have to think about that as well. What can the president say to the American people, but what is national security that maybe shouldn't be said, or how do you keep the morale up in the country to support your troops, which obviously becomes a little bit of an issue during the Vietnam War. So as I said before, they took the first fork in the road, and they increased troops. By January 1966, there were 175,000 troops in Vietnam due to the change. Johnson attempted to open the channel of communication with Ho Chi Minh, saying, like, we can pull forces out if there's an honorable, lasting peace that can be reached. The administration attempted 72 times to have peace initiatives between 1965 and then the opening of the Paris peace talks in May of 1968. And LBJ announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election March 31st, 1968. And at that time, they halted bombing over North Vietnam so that they could encourage negotiations. And that's, leads into the Paris peace talks. I think that there are a lot of different ways you can incorporate these into your classroom, which I've kind of discussed before, and any ideas that you might have, feel free to share in the chat. I've also thought about using any and all of the documents if you attended both of these webinars or just this one, that you see the documents and either pose a question or a DBQ to your students, having them looking at the policy shifts in the Vietnam War and determining maybe which of these critical moments or which of these policy decisions had the greatest effect on the outcome of the war. So that's what I have for you guys today. I know it was a very quick and dirty LBJ in the Vietnam War, but if you have questions, you can share them in the chat, and I think Katie will get to those at the end. So,
great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Amanda. It's really interesting to see both the private and public aspects of this decision-making process, as you pointed out, and to have your students consider with every decision a choice is being made. So I think you've added some great documents for the classroom. We're now going to switch over to the Nixon Library to share some additional documents from the Nixon administration.
Hi, everyone. I've got two documents I want to share with you today. The first one is a memo to Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor to the President, from Tony Lake. Tony Lake's very interesting. He's in the Nixon administration and the National Security Council this time. He'll go on to be the National Security Advisor to Bill Clinton in the 1990s. However, in this memo, he's writing about the war in Vietnam, and he states at the beginning that he has a very pessimistic view of how things are going in the war. He acknowledges on page 2 in the second paragraph that time is not on the side of the United States. The tide of public opinion is running against the war. However, he does not mention that Congress is also leaning against the war and in that direction of the anti-war movement in '69, and will become particularly harsh by 1972. In this quote, he states that Hanoi's adoption of a strategy designed to wait us out fits both with its doctrine of how to fight a revolutionary war and with its expectations about increasingly significant problems for the United States. Essentially, what he's stating is that it's possible that the North Vietnamese could just wait the United States out, and that was a great fear he had, because he also goes on to talk about significant internal problems within the United States. Specifically, he mentions the October 15th is what he's mentioning, is the October 15th Vietnam Memorial Day that's coming up, and it's a national demonstration against the war, which included teach-ins, a letter from the North Vietnamese Premier Pham Van Dong to the American people, and will be followed up a month later on November 15th by a mobilization day in Washington, D.C., which will have over 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. protesting against the war. And these protests serve as a foreshadowing of the campus protests that will occur later on in 1970 after the invasion of Cambodia, choice made by the Nixon administration, and the resulting issues that will come up in both Kent State and Jackson State. So Tony Lake goes on and then tries to discuss some of the U.S. strategies, trying to let Kissinger know what's happening and so they can decide where to move forward. Lake remains unconvinced that Vietnamization will work. Fear that Nixon may get stuck in a manner as LBJ did with very few alternatives to work with. He does not foresee a path to military victory or peace, but still believes that the U.S. can hurt North Vietnamese militarily, but the war cannot be won within 2 years. Why that's important is because Nixon believes once he gets in the White House that the war in Vietnam, and for him to be successful as a president, he must end the war as quickly as possible. If it lasts until the by-year elections in 1970, that would be a horrific thing for the Republicans. And if it lasts until 1972, he fears in 1969 that he could not get reelected. So they're looking for how they can end this war as quickly and efficiently as possible. Tony Lake goes on to say something that I think is really interesting as well. He's talking about Vietnamization, and he says that the withdrawal of U.S. forces will be like salted peanuts. There will be a continued desire for more, and eventually, if we continue to withdraw forces, we will unilaterally withdraw without receiving anything back from the North Vietnamese. He also mentions that part of the U.S. strategy is we've got to broaden the government in Saigon. Hugh has not done that. It limits his appeal, and that these peace negotiations, which they hope to start, could actually endanger the future of the Saigon government itself. One of the interesting things is that Kissinger and Nixon, during these negotiations, did not keep the president of South Vietnam up to date on their negotiating positions. In conclusion, Tony Lake states that, in brief, I do not believe we can make enough evident progress in Vietnam to hold the line within the United States. What he's meaning about progress is military progress. Both North Vietnam and the United States are both have policies that put the predominance on a military solution to the war. And he also goes on to say, on the other hand, Hanoi has adopted a strategy which it should be able to maintain for some time, barring some break like the Sino-Soviet hostilities. On the following page, on the last page, this pessimistic analysis of our present position persuades me that we should not wait for the predicted difficulties in our present course. Our choice then is to find a solution either through shocking the North Vietnamese into a settlement militarily, or through giving up more of our goals than we have hitherto found possible. So it's very prescient the way that he puts this memo together, and then he outlines the two options that Nixon will take. And he attempts through the invasion of Cambodia to shock the North Vietnamese, and then at the same time to enter into secret negotiations. Which brings me to the second document, which is an analysis or an overview of the July 19th secret negotiations that Kissinger underwent with the North Vietnamese. Why this is important is this is the first meeting since May of '72, so they've gone almost 2 months. And their previous meeting was in the midst of the Easter Offensive conducted by the North Vietnamese, and was going extremely well for the North Vietnamese during those negotiations. As a result, the North Vietnamese were intransigent and weren't negotiating and didn't think they had anything to negotiate because they thought that there was a possibility their armed forces would overrun the South Vietnamese. When that did not occur as a result of massive U.S. intervention through air support, that is when they come back to the negotiating table, and when the North Vietnamese Politburo now put an emphasis on negotiation. The United States had given up earlier, within the past 2 years, any hopes of a military settlement and had put all of its eggs in the basket of diplomacy, which is where we are in July of 1972. So they've staved off the attack. Kissinger mentions in the memo to Nixon constantly the non-polemical tone of the negotiations with the North Vietnamese. Why this is important is the previous few meetings had been very polemical in nature. This new tone to the negotiations mentioned by Kissinger is in direct contradiction of previous attitudes, and he believes it will lead to future results. He also believes that this is the result of the North Vietnamese coming to the conclusion they cannot defeat the South Vietnamese as long as the U.S. is involved, and the damage of U.S. bombing of burgeoning North Vietnamese industrial areas in 1972. So both sides seem to give somewhat during this memo, and it's the Great Thaw that then leads to the decision for peace by October of '72, when the first agreement is signed between the U.S. and North Vietnamese. The U.S., and as part of the key changes, supports a ceasefire in place. In other words, the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese forces will ceasefire in place in South Vietnam while the United States withdraws unilaterally. In previous negotiations, the U.S. had always demanded for a joint and simultaneous evacuation of the North Vietnamese and the U.S. from South Vietnam. Also, the North Vietnamese dropped their demand for a complete overhaul of the South Vietnamese government. Right now, they've changed. They've always asked that the government must be deposed. Thieu, the president, must be deposed. They still are requesting Thieu to leave, but they don't ask for the complete government overhaul. This is the very beginning of this negotiation and moving forward. They also say that the United States can continue to provide aid to the South Vietnamese government, which is also a new proposal. And both sides agree that the South Vietnamese government and the People's Revolutionary Government, the political version of the NLF, should begin talking towards national reconciliation. Key stumbling blocks. The U.S. still views the negotiations as a military negotiation. In other words, the military issues are the most important. POWs being of that group the most important of all. They're willing to bend on some of the issues, but they're not looking at the political issues. Why? The United States is trying to extricate itself from the situation. The North Vietnamese are looking at the political issues as being very important. Why? Once the United States leaves, they want to be able to still have an impact on the South Vietnamese government. They don't want an independent, non-communist, and strong South Vietnamese government. Their hope is continually to reunite the two halves. So at this point, the United States is looking to withdraw its forces in return for the POWs. The North Vietnamese look at the POWs as their great bargaining chip. They don't want to return the POWs until the political issues have been resolved. And we see here that first move toward resolving some of those issues. And in its final form, the peace agreement will be, in essence, an opportunity for a face-saving agreement for the U.S. government to extricate its military forces from South Vietnam. And as mentioned in many of the two of the White House conversations, is it also gives the U.S. government a decent interval in case things go horribly wrong for the South Vietnamese government. This is that opportunity to end the war and at least ensure that there will be a space and a time between U.S. extrication and the fall of the South Vietnamese government. This is also the prevailing theory among historians today over the Paris Peace Accords.
All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions regarding these documents, feel free to send them via chat. We will have time at the end for questions, but thank you for sharing these two documents that provide some really interesting insight into the Nixon administration and the end of the Vietnam War. Now we are going to pass it to our to Barbara at the Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Katie. Well, I'm going to be taking a little bit different approach since Gerald Ford became president after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. I'm going to go back and give you a little bit of history because it tells you a lot about why he made some of the decisions that he made. Gerald Ford served in the Navy in World War II, and when he came home, he had turned into a staunch internationalist. He was talked into running for Congress locally against an isolationist after World War II. He did and was successful, and he held those internationalist beliefs throughout his career and his life. So that's one really key point. He also was involved with Vietnam as a young congressman. He was sent on a fact-finding mission in 1953 to South Vietnam. So his knowledge of the issues surrounding South Vietnam was pretty deep, going back, like I said, to the early 50s. So keeping those things in mind, Gerald Ford became president on August 9th, 1974, like I said, after the Paris Peace Accords had been signed, but at a time where there was just so much distrust and discord in the United States. We had Richard Nixon resigning because of Watergate, and shortly thereafter then Ford's pardon of Nixon. We had, the oil crisis, energy crisis. We had inflation and unemployment and just a real distrust of government and of our leaders. And so Ford came in with the country kind of in upheaval, similar in many ways to how it is right now. And the Vietnam War was technically ended, but by that time when he was sworn in, the North Vietnamese were starting to build up their forces again, and so President Ford had to decide what to do. I'm going to focus on two things. I kind of talk about this as closing a chapter, because he didn't have a lot to do with policy having to do with the war since it was technically over, but he had a lot of odds and ends, a lot of loose ends that needed to be wrapped up. And I'm going to be looking at a couple of those. One, the refugees from South Vietnam, and the other, clemency. So, Gerald Ford, Gerald Ford wanted to help the refugees, and that came partly because of his internationalist viewpoint, and he felt that we had a moral obligation to help these people who had been our allies, who we had been working side by side with, both the military and the civilians, and he did not want to just abandon them. So he asked Congress for additional funding for the refugee resettlement, and they did approve that, and the document that you're looking at right now is the act that was approved by Congress. And I don't have my glasses on, and this is little tiny print, but it was, I believe, like $544,000 that was approved, or $1 million, I'm sorry, $455 million that was approved to help with the South Vietnamese refugees. So if we can go to the next image, we had some technical difficulties, and so there were really several phases of refugee resettlement that Gerald Ford dealt with. The first one was Operation Baby Lift. That was that started in early April of 1975, where the United States, with the assistance of several other nations, started evacuating orphans and young children who'd been separated from their parents and getting them out of South Vietnam. So that took place during the month of April 1975. Over 10,000 young people were rescued that way. Sad story, one of the first planes to take off that was filled with the orphans and children crashed, and everybody on board was killed. So then it came into question whether or not that was the right thing to do, but they continued on, and like I said, got over 10,000 children out of South Vietnam in the month of April. So we have that. The next one is the final evacuation of Saigon on April 28th, 29th of 1975. And that's when Ford was tasked with getting not only the staff of the U.S. Embassy out and some of the remaining U.S. military, but also South Vietnamese military leaders who had been working closely with us, whose lives and whose families' lives were at risk, and also civilians, as many civilians as possible that had been helping us and working with the United States. So on, like I said, April 28th and 29th, he rescued, by using, well, first the airport and then helicopters, as many people as absolutely possible from the embassy compound in Saigon. They would land helicopters on the tops of buildings and on the ground, and they would fill them up with, like I said, the Americans, the employees at the embassy workers, military, and South Vietnamese. They'd fly out to ships that were offshore and let the people off onto the ships and fly back and rescue more. So that took place over about 24 hours, getting the rest of the Americans and many, many South Vietnamese out. Some of it was rather orderly in the beginning. We have a lot of South Vietnamese refugees and their families here. Well, they're South Vietnamese Americans now, but here in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. And one, it's an interesting story, as a couple, the young man at the time, his father was a high-ranking military officer in South Vietnam. So they were given the luxury of about 3 hours' notice to pack up a few worldly belongings and some food and get to the airport. His wife was one of the boat people who had basically no warning. They snuck out in the middle of the night. So some really interesting stories there with the people that were rescued from South Vietnam. And then the third is the boat people that I referred to, and they came later. Some of them were leaving at the same time in the end of April, but they ended up adrift in the ocean or in other countries temporarily before they got to the United States. But it's estimated there were about 135,000 boat people. I'll share a story. I don't have this in a format that I can share with you electronically, and I apologize, but one of Tina, the young woman that I was telling you about that was one of the boat people, shared her experiences. And if you have any South Vietnamese refugees in your community that you can talk with or interview, do an oral history with, absolutely stunning. It's just, it's hard to comprehend what they went through, 40, 50, 60 people on boats made for 10, out adrift at sea for weeks at a time. Just really heartbreaking stories. So there were the three waves, really, the orphans, Operation Baby Lift, and the final evacuation, and then following that, the boat people. There were also some that walked out of South Vietnam that we ended up rescuing. They walked, many of them, through Cambodia. A gentleman locally tried 3 times. He got partway into Cambodia, was arrested, brought back, imprisoned, got out, walked again, got caught, brought back in prison, got out, walked again, and the 3rd time he finally got through Cambodia and was rescued. So, like I said, a variety of different means of getting out, but it was something that was very important to President Ford. At the time, something similar to what we're experiencing now, a lot of people in the United States were, fed up with the Vietnam War. People had had it. They just wanted to put it behind us, get on to more positive things, and they weren't real thrilled about the South Vietnamese refugees coming to the United States. But President Ford, again, just felt like it was our obligation to do what we could to help them. So that's the first part. And then the second is, lessons. That's right, I'm sorry. Things to do with your classroom. Some of the things that we do, like I said, we have the oral histories. We bring in, we've located some of the refugees in our community, and we bring them in to talk to school groups or have school groups interview them. You can compare and contrast their refugee stories from South Vietnam, with those from World War II, also some contemporary refugees. So a lot of similarities between the end of the Vietnam War and now, and you can find, I found on YouTube some really interesting current refugee stories that you can use to compare with the South Vietnamese. And again, the World War II refugees, not a lot of them left, but that's another interesting direction to go. So that's it with the refugees. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about is the Clemency Program. And not being faint of heart, Gerald Ford announced that he was going to develop a Clemency Program 10 days into his new administration, and he did it in Chicago at the annual Veterans of Foreign Wars convention. He went there and announced that he wanted to develop some kind of clemency program, and we couldn't load the one document that I wanted to look at, so we've got the proclamation here, but then I'm just going to read you a little bit from the document, and you'll be getting these documents in the mail too. Some of them are quite long as well. As minority leader of the House and recently as Vice President, I stated my strong conviction that unconditional blanket amnesty for anyone who illegally evaded or fled military service is wrong. It is wrong. Yet, in my first words as President of all the people, I acknowledged a power higher than the people who commands not only righteousness but love, not only justice but mercy. So he wanted to develop a program where draft dodgers, draft evaders could earn their way back to the country and to citizenship. And they wouldn't just be forgiven and allowed to walk back in, but they would have to really put their hearts into it and earn their way back in. And like I said, he announced this program first to the veterans of foreign wars, and you can imagine the response to that with his audience was not real positive. Then in September, the following month, he actually put his program forward, announcing the actual details of the program. And again, we will be sending you that document. I apologize that we couldn't get it up. But he says in the beginning, in my first week as president, I asked the Attorney General of the United States and the Secretary of Defense to report to me after consultation with other government officials and private citizens concerned on the status of those young Americans who have been convicted, charged, investigated, or are still being sought as draft evaders or military deserters. So within that first month, he announced the program on August 19th, and by September 16th, he had the program outlined and was releasing the details of it. I'm not sure who our audience is, how many of you are closer to my age and remember all of this, or how many of you are younger, but the country was so divided at the time, and we also had the draft, unlike now. So President Ford really felt like he wanted to help heal the country, number one from Nixon and from Watergate and the mistrust, but also from the Vietnam War. And so that's why he wanted to find a compromise where the draft evaders could earn their way back into the good graces in the country. We have in our collection some really interesting things. A lot of veterans were not happy about this, as you can imagine, and returned their uniforms and many of their medals and awards to President Ford, to the White House, in protest of the Clemency Program. A lot of interesting things you can do with this with your students, even though we don't have a draft now. Veterans can be interviewed. Non-veterans from the time can be interviewed. There are some draft evaders who are back in the country that will admit to being one that left, and you can talk to them when you track them down. You could do writing prompts, the pros and cons of clemency for the draft evaders, the pros and cons of a draft. Like I said, we don't have that now, so we don't have the same issues that we had in Vietnam. But students can discuss and debate the pros and cons of the draft or the draft evaders. Research into the demographics of who was drafted for the Vietnam War, who wasn't drafted, who had deferments, and who left, and why they left, to see what the demographics are between the different groups, who served and who didn't serve. So those are the main points. Again, I apologize that we couldn't get my documents up, but we will get those to you. And if you have any questions during the chat, just let me know.
Great. Thanks so much, Barbara. If you have any additional questions about these documents, feel free to send us a chat. We will have time for questions at the end of our program today. Additionally, we will send out the supporting documents that Barbara mentioned as well. So I have a long list of links to send you via email. But before we conclude today's program, I want to share some additional resources for teaching the Vietnam War and also shed some light on the records of Congress. We've been focusing in this two-part series on presidential policy and documents of the different presidential libraries, but at the National Archives, we also have the Center for Legislative Archives, where we can explore the history of the United States House of Representatives and the Senate. So I'm going to explore one of those documents with you, as well as connect you with additional resources at docsteach.org. So this will be a little bit of a repeat for those of you joining us from last week, but we'll also dive into a new activity on the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so this is docsteach.org, the online tool for teaching with documents from the National Archives. From docsteach.org, you can explore primary source documents, discover activities you can teach with, and if you create a free account, you can create your own fun and engaging activities using primary sources. A free account will also allow you to explore other activities created by teachers as well. But to access the resources we've pulled together for teaching in the classroom on the Vietnam War, you can explore the popular topics page on the Vietnam War. On this page, we've curated a collection of primary sources on different topics and pulled together teaching activities that relate to the Vietnam War and the era. As I mentioned, as you've seen, we focused a lot on policy, but within the records of the United States government, we can find records that help us explore different topics, including photographs of U.S. troops in Vietnam, we can also explore more records related to the topics covered by some of our presenters this evening. Go back to the main page to see some of the themes that we've pulled from, including looking at documents related to negotiation and peace, documents related to the fall of Saigon and evacuation, refugees, and so on. We can also take a look at teaching activities that the National Archives has created for teaching the Vietnam War, as well as other teaching activities that cover topics from this time period. This is an activity we've put together on analyzing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the original draft resolution from the records of the United States Senate. On the activity page, you will see the suggested teaching instructions for facilitating this activity in your classroom, and also see the intended grade level and the matching Bloom taxonomy level, thinking skill, and historical era. But let's go ahead and take a look at this document. So this is the resolution. If we zoom in, we can see that this document tells a story, as all documents do, and provides some incredible details for students to analyze and think about how it represents the process of legislation, how it represents the circumstances under which this document was created. In this activity, students are encouraged to go through the steps of document analysis. They meet the document, they observe its parts, they try to make sense of it, and use it as historical evidence. And one thing we want students to think about in this activity is, what does Congress authorize the president to do, and what rationale does Congress used to justify this authorization. So by going through this analysis process and really focusing on those whereas statements, students can pull out this information from this document. They can also think about, are there any limitations to the President's authority in this document or not? So this can be an excellent document to bring into your classroom when you are teaching the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and to think about the role Congress plays in the decisions that are being made, especially as later in the war the Tonkin Gulf Resolution will actually be repealed. So I hope this provides you some additional tools for teaching the Vietnam War in your classroom. Well, I want to go ahead and bring back our presenters for questions in case there are any questions out there tonight, and say a big thank you to all of my co-presenters for joining us and sharing these incredible resources. Also, just want to point out that we have a current exhibition opening here in Washington, D.C. called Remembering Vietnam, 12 Critical Episodes in the Vietnam War. This will be open until January 6, 2019. And that a traveling exhibit picturing Nam, U.S. military photography of the Vietnam War, is actually currently at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. And I just want to say again, a huge thank you to my fellow presenters this evening. Thank you so much for taking time to share your resources, and that about wraps up our program. So thanks, everyone.